Hi, welcome to Chiltern Heritage Orchards. Today we're going to be looking at the only two inputs that we put into the orchard in terms of feeding, because not only are we organic, we're also regenerative. Stay tuned. These are the two inputs that we use to feed the trees. Now, feeding trees organically is very, very difficult. You have to think through what you're putting into the trees. It's more about what you don't use. So we don't use nitrates, we don't use phosphates, and we don't use commercial fertilizers that have been manufactured. Everything we use is naturally derived. So the first thing to remember is when you're planting that the soil may contain quite a lot of nutrition already, but what it probably lacks are trace elements. Well, what are trace elements? The trace elements are the tiny cogs in the vast machinery of the plant. If they're missing, or there are a few of them missing, you'll have a lot of problems running your trees. So in this rock dust, which is derived from basalt in Scotland, you've got most of the naturally occurring micronutrients that may be lacking in the soil. So for example, these contain cobalt, manganese, molybdenum, selenium, copper, iron, and also sulfur and some phosphorus and some potassium, calcium and magnesium. All of those different nutrients, some of them are trace elements, some of them are major nutrients. But actually, rather than thinking of them in those terms, just think of them all as important. They all have different roles. The missing one is nitrogen. There's no nitrogen in this. And that's because most of the nitrogen that we feed our trees doesn't come from the fertiliser. It actually comes from the nitrogen fixed in the soil by nitrogen fixing bacteria, the azotobacter, and some of the rhizobium that live on clover, or some of the recycled protein that comes from the grass that's been digested by the sheep. So the nitrogen inputs are very minimal from us. The other source of nutrient is this, which is maxi-crop seaweed, which is a product which is well known in organic circles. It's extremely soluble, naturally occurring nutrients, including nitrogen, but most of the nitrogen is held in a protein form. In fact, all of the contents here are derived from seaweed, which has been naturally filtered and manufactured to make the nutrients as liked by the plant as possible, or as natural as possible. So first of all, with rock dust, the reason it's becoming so important in commercial growing, in organic growing, and in regenerative growing as well, which we'll talk about in a minute, is because it's naturally derived and it's one of the missing ingredients from a lot of soils. As soils weather, they lose a lot of their minerals naturally through weathering, and over the centuries, you need to replace those in some way. And the easiest way of doing that is to use what nature would use, which is volcanic eruptions, uplift, erosion, and deposition. And this comes from a basalt source. It breaks down in the soil very slowly, takes a very long time. But what it does do is release the nutrients in a form that's very rapidly taken up by the bacteria in the soil. And once they're taken up by the bacteria, they're passed into the root hair cells of the plants and they're cycled through in a very organic form, a protein-based form. Nutrients are normally hard to get hold of. Things like manganese, cobalt, copper, iron, which are often unavailable even when they're present in the soil, are rapidly absorbed in this form by bacteria and pass through the bacterial chain into the root system. And that makes it extremely effective. It's also very good for raising the amount of wildlife in the soil. I've noticed there's a lot more worms in the soil when I've started using this product. So that's been a great help. The seaweed is used later on. We use the seaweed at critical points in the growth of the trees during the year. And the first time it's used is as a root drench, usually after blossom has set. And that's important because one of the weak points in a tree's growth is when they've just had their first flush of blossom. They start to be quite low in nutrients, and if you top them up at that point, diseases often are avoided. And then the next times that we start to use seaweed during the season would be during the fruit set period. And you can either do it as a root drench or you can spray it on the foliage. Some people find foliar sprays much more effective. They direct the nutrient into where it's needed. The only problem I have with that is that if you have a dry spell, there is a risk that you'll end up scorching the leaves. So I favour foliar feeding only when we've had a lot of rain. Otherwise, I tend to use it as a root drench. And we'll talk about application rates later. And then later on, we do a third feed with this when the fruit is filling, when it's actually developing above a sort of walnut size. And then the final feed is normally just before harvest, just to top up the nutrients again. So that's 4 times a year normally that it's applied. And that's it in terms of nutrient inputs, because we only use the rock dust in the winter, and the application rate for that is normally 70 grams or a couple of ounces per square metre or square yard. So to sum up, these are the only inputs that we really use, and as a result our trees are very healthy. But stay tuned for more information on nutrition, and don't forget we're on Instagram as well. Catch you soon.